Welcome. You found your way to the quiet side of the truth. Tonight, let your mind drift as we gently explore the shadows behind power, the whispers behind history, and the mystery that is the Illuminati. So take a deep breath, sink into the comfort of your pillow, and let the soft hum of secrets lull you to sleep. From ancient Bavarian roots to modern whispers of hidden influence, we'll unravel it all, slowly, carefully, one symbol, one secret, at a time. Before we begin, if this kind of calm curiosity helps you rest, tap like and gently press subscribe so you never miss a night of whispered wonder. Now, close your eyes and listen closely, because in the quiet, you just might hear the truth. What if the symbols you see every day on dollar bills, in pop culture, even in corporate logos, weren't coincidences? Could these hidden in plain sight signs reveal a secret plan for world domination? Tonight, we'll uncover why some believe these clues point to a centuries-old society quietly controlling the fate of nations. The symbols you miss every day. Have you ever wondered if the symbols you pass by every day might be saying more than you think? We see them on banknotes, in the logos of global corporations, even in the corners of pop music videos. At first glance, they're just shapes and designs, nothing to think twice about. But then, a question lingers. Could there be something deeper? Something intentionally layered into their design? Is it possible these familiar visuals have hidden meanings, left behind for those who know how to spot them? This idea, often dismissed as wild speculation, forms the backbone of one of the most enduring conspiracy theories in history. Take the pyramid, for example, the image etched into every US $1 bill, crowned at its peak by an eye gazing through radiating beams of light. You've seen it hundreds, maybe thousands of times, but does it strike you as odd that a pyramid, an ancient Egyptian symbol, appears on the currency of a modern democracy? The composition alone raises some questions. The Latin phrase beneath it, Novus Ordo Seclorum, translates to New Order of the Ages, which some claim hints at the dawn of a secretive, controlling regime. Above the pyramid sits Annuit Captis, meaning he has favoured our undertakings. When paired together, skeptics argue these phrases reveal a coded message of allegiance to this clandestine order, an order they believe has been quietly manipulating global systems for centuries. And it doesn't stop there. The all-seeing eye, also called the Eye of Providence, is perhaps the core symbol most widely linked to Illuminati conspiracy theories. It's been interpreted as an emblem of omnipotence, signifying some higher power that observes and governs all. But for others, it's not about spiritual oversight, it's about control, surveillance, and influence. This is where the conspiracy deepens. Everyone sees the symbol every day, but most don't think to question its meaning. That's how it stays hidden, hiding in plain sight. But the symbols aren't confined to historical curiosities like currency design. They crop up in places you'd least expect, often in the logos of massive corporations. The triangular shape of certain tech giants' branding, the use of the all-seeing eye-inspired motifs in the entertainment industry, they all point to what theorists call a language of power. Consider the unique triangular imagery used by companies like Delta Airlines, AOL, or even the simple geometry behind Google's play button. Then there's the use of the classic pyramid structure, woven into designs for luxury fashion houses and sprawling financial institutions. Is it a coincidence, or is there a specific message encoded in these choices? One of the most debated examples comes from the world of music videos and live performances. Certain pop stars have been accused of visually mimicking Illuminati symbols, whether through hand gestures, set designs, or wardrobe choices. For instance, many fans have pointed out that in some performances, artists cover one eye deliberately, said to mirror the all-seeing eye. In other cases, pyramidal props seem unnervingly central and deliberate in their presentation. Beyoncé, Jay-Z, Rihanna, these names often come up when these coincidences are discussed, with theorists suggesting that they've aligned themselves with the alleged Illuminati elite. However, those within these industries have often shrugged off the claims, dismissing them as misunderstood artistic expression, or in some cases, marketing stunts designed to spark controversy. Historically, symbols like the pyramid and the all-seeing eye weren't meant to inspire mystery. The pyramid was an established metaphor for strength and durability, often used to symbolize progress or ambition. Similarly, the eye, when enclosed in a triangle, signifies a divine presence or protective guidance across many cultures. But as these symbols were adopted by secretive organizations centuries ago, like the Freemasons, their meanings began to shift, or at least be interpreted differently by outsiders. Freemasonry, which often incorporated pyramidal structures into its rituals and designs, remains linked in many theories to the broader Illuminati network. Some researchers, though, link the overlap more to shared symbolism than any direct connection. Let's touch on the Illuminati itself. The original Bavarian Illuminati, which dates back to the late 18th century, aimed to challenge established authority structures, particularly those tied to religion and monarchy. They believed in spreading Enlightenment ideals, but their methods, which reportedly included secret meetings, coded correspondence, and enigmatic rituals, created an air of suspicion. Even after the group officially disbanded under government pressure, whispers of its continued influence persisted. Over time, symbols like the ones they adopted, or were rumoured to have used, became inextricably tied to the idea of a hidden group working from behind the curtain of public life. From the pyramids on banknotes to glyph-like logos and covert gestures in entertainment, the theory operates on the idea of a larger system of control. You're not just seeing a triangle in a company's branding, they'd say. You're seeing allegiance to an unspoken world order. Some suggest this as a form of psychological warfare, subtly reinforcing dominance by placing coded markers in plain view, leaving the unsuspecting public unaware of their unconscious power. To take the theory even further, believers claim these groups use these symbolic nods to communicate internally, as well as to signal their influence over widespread media, commerce, and even politics. But it's not just modern-day theorists who've supported the idea of symbology as a tool for power. Researchers have pointed out that the use of visual language to reinforce authority dates back thousands of years. Think of ancient Rome, where the state deliberately aligned its symbols, laurels, eagles, and scepters, with depictions of the gods, signaling divine authority. Similarly, Many monarchies throughout history adopted intricate crests and visual codes to remind their subjects of their unmatched lineage. In many ways, symbols have always served as a form of control, compelling faith, consolidating authority, and unifying identities under shared banners. The difference now, the theorists argue, is that today's power structures are infinitely harder to see, leaving these symbols as the only visible evidence of their existence. And yet, not everyone believes the theory. Skeptics argue that the supposed connections are exaggerated at best, or entirely fabricated at worst. A pyramid made of 3 sides. A coincidence, they'd say, stemming from fundamental geometry, not an Illuminati blueprint for power. The recurring appearance of the all-seeing eye, simply a historical design choice with no deeper implications. But imagine the alternative for a moment. Imagine these symbols really were pieces of a carefully curated puzzle. What might that puzzle reveal if it were ever completed? When you start looking more closely, it's not just about the symbols themselves, but their repetition. The sheer frequency with which they appear in modern visuals has led many to believe they're not coincidental. After all, if they're just random, why do they appear in such specific formats and such influential places? This rotation of recurrence feeds into the gravitational pull of the theory, making it harder to dismiss. It's not enough to call it imagination gone wild. It's a pattern with pieces waiting to be unraveled. Ultimately, whether you believe the symbols are coincidental or deliberate, what stands out is their persistence. These are not fleeting visuals. They've endured through centuries, woven into everything from political systems to corporate empires. So the question returns, if these are clues, then who is leaving them behind and why? The Vance dynasty, a family of secrets. Imagine growing up surrounded by wealth so vast that it shaped your view of the world before you even understood it. For Elias Vance, marble hallways, sprawling estates and private jets were his playground. Yet, even as a child, he sensed that he was living in a shadow. The lavish dinners and sparkling chandeliers only served as distractions. Beneath the surface, his life wasn't just about privilege. It was controlled, calculated, and carefully choreographed. Every family dinner felt strange, like the parts of a play performed by actors who never missed their lines. The Vance name carried power, something his father, Victor Vance, liked to remind him of often. For Victor, power wasn't about money, not directly. Our family invests in certain endeavors that shape the course of nations, he would say, his voice firm with emphasis. We hold knowledge that few can imagine, but knowledge is worthless without discipline. To Elias, these statements carried a weight he didn't fully understand, but couldn't escape. They weren't just words, they were warnings. Elias's childhood home was both mesmerizing and eerie. Marble staircases wound up to rooms so grand they felt like cathedrals. The family's crest was displayed in every corner, an ornate, ancient design with an eye encased within the sharp angles of a pyramid-like shape. At first it seemed like just a decorative emblem, something to pass by without a second thought. Until, one day, Elias made the mistake of asking too many questions. "What does our crest mean?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. Victor's reaction was swift. He leaned in close, his tone chilling in its finality. "You saw nothing. Speak of it again, and there will be consequences." This wasn't an isolated moment. The warning echoed a pattern in the Vance household that Elias gradually recognized as he grew older. Things happened behind closed doors, often after midnight. He would wake to the muffled hum of voices drifting through the walls. Once, unable to resist his curiosity, Elias crept down the long, cold corridor that led to the library. The door was slightly ajar, and through it, he glimpsed something that stayed with him forever. The sight of his father surrounded by a circle of men and women dressed in dark robes, chanting softly in unison. The scent of incense hung thick in the air, swirling through the glow of candlelight that cast flickering shadows across their faces. At the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, carved with the same crest he had seen so many times. He didn't know then what he was witnessing, but he knew one thing without doubt. It wasn't meant for him to see. Victor had always been a towering figure, both literally and figuratively. From the way he spoke to the way he walked, everything about him commanded attention. And while he never explicitly told Elias his future, there were moments that hinted at it clearly enough. "One day, you'll stand in that circle," Victor said to him once, almost casually, as if it was a certainty, not a choice. To Elias, the comment felt more like a verdict than an invitation. The family wasn't just rich, it was responsible for something bigger, something purposefully hidden. As time went on, Elias began to realize just how little he truly knew about the life he'd been born into. It wasn't just the rituals that unsettled him. It was the secrecy of it all, the way nothing was ever explained outright. The Vance family kept a handwritten tome titled Bloodline, locked in a glass case in their private study. Whenever he caught glimpses of its pages, Elias saw lists of genealogies stretching back centuries and what appeared to be cryptic references to events much larger than the family itself. Wars, elections, financial crashes, they all seemed to tie back to the Vance name in some way he couldn't yet piece together. Victor once told him, the masses can't handle the real illusions. They need their illusions. Democracy, free markets, freedom, we provide it. As a young boy, Elias wasn't sure what to make of these statements. The meaning behind illusions hung like a low fog over his thoughts in the years that followed. Slowly, he began to connect the dots. The family crest, the whispered gatherings, the hints about their control over stability in a chaotic world. It all seemed to add up, but the picture wasn't clear. It was as though his childhood was a puzzle, with pieces intentionally left missing. Real-world theorists often point to families like the Vances when trying to explain how secret societies might operate. They cite examples from history, such as the Rothschilds in global finance, or the alleged hidden power of the British royal family, as a framework for understanding these kinds of narratives. Wealth alone, they argue, doesn't keep power locked in place. Rituals, symbols, and a tightly controlled lineage play just as significant a role. This is where the story begins to blur, where documented history and speculative theory intertwine. Many conspiracy theories attribute incredible influence to elite families, claiming they have access to ancient knowledge and use it to maintain control. While there's little concrete evidence to validate these claims, the image of a family like the Vances feeds into this idea perfectly. Families who consider themselves caretakers of the world's systems, believing it's their responsibility to manipulate events behind the scenes to ensure order. Hidden councils, cryptic gatherings, and an unbroken focus on legacy. These elements are woven into the very DNA of the myths surrounding secret societies like the Illuminati. For Elias, however, these myths weren't abstract. They were his reality. One of his most vivid memories came when he accidentally uncovered a secret passage beneath the east wing of their estate. What he found there was nothing short of alarming. Locked cabinets filled with documents detailing shadowy agreements, lists of names he didn't recognize, and images of symbols that mirrored the designs he had seen etched into their home. It was as though everything he'd suspected was finally confirmed, though the findings left him with more questions than answers. Victor's grip on the family and on Elias was unrelenting. His lessons weren't confined to words. They bled into every part of their lives, from the way Elias was expected to carry himself in public to the cryptic codes of behavior he was told to memorize. Victor insisted on teaching Elias that certain truths were never to leave the boundaries of their inner circle. When questioned, Elias was met with cold reminders of his responsibilities. "What we hold isn't meant to be shared lightly," Victor once said. "The world only sees what we allow them to see." As a child, it weighed heavily on Elias, though he didn't yet have the language to describe it. The symbols, the rituals, the warnings not to question anything. For years, he simply packed these experiences away, hoping they'd make sense in time. But what they really did was plant seeds of doubt, the kind that grew beneath the surface, quietly branching out until they couldn't be ignored. So what happens when a child starts to grow older and sees their family through different eyes? For Elias, this was no ordinary coming-of-age story. It wasn't just about breaking away from an imposing father or rebelling against household rules. It was about unraveling his own existence, learning what it truly meant to be born of Vance. More importantly, it was about deciding whether or not he wanted to accept the role he'd been groomed for since the day he was born. And with that, the question becomes, what truths might a child uncover as they grow older in a family like this? The Academy of Influence. Elias Vance's world grew stranger the moment he stepped through the wide iron gates of the academy. It was nothing like the schools other kids attended, though he hadn't known many children outside the cloistered circles of his parents' dinner parties and carefully chosen playdates. The academy wasn't merely extravagant, though its sprawling gardens and marble-columned buildings certainly gave that impression. It felt off. The silence was too deliberate, the air heavy with a weight of expectations no one fully explained. Elias learned quickly that this wasn't a place for questioning things aloud. It was a stage, and everyone moved across it as though following some invisible script. Even at 13, Elias noticed how teachers treated him differently. At first, he dismissed it as politeness, a small smile here, a nod of approval even when his work wasn't stellar. But it wasn't long before he saw their reverence for what it was, a calculated hesitance, as though they were afraid of offending him. The other students too seemed to hold him at arm's length. Conversations would seem relaxed, casual, until someone mentioned his last name. That's when they would shift. Their tone would brighten excessively, or their laughter would suddenly feel forced. The effect was subtle, but it was there. And Elias wondered if anyone would ever see him without the shadow of his family hanging over him like a storm cloud. The lessons at the academy were both ordinary and strange. There were the typical math equations and historical timelines, but interspersed throughout were classes that left Elias puzzled. Leadership seminar was a required course twice a week, taught by a professor whose voice carried the commanding weight of someone who had likely instructed royalty. The syllabus involved little practical advice on leadership. No strategies for decision-making, no team-building exercises. Instead, they discussed the power of perception, how one's image could dominate a room, how knowing what people wanted most made them easy to guide. The masses respond to symbols and stories, not facts, the professor said one afternoon, pacing as he clasped his hands behind his back. Control the narrative, and you control the audience. Elias tried to brush it off like any normal teenager might. It was boring, unnecessarily abstract, surely meant for someone else. Yet moments like that began to pile up, and the sense of unease they left only deepened. He couldn't ignore how certain lessons seemed designed to prepare them for something bigger than college or careers. Occasionally, there would be a faint reference to global leadership or terms like stewards of change, but no one ever clarified what it all pointed to. As weeks turned into months, a pattern emerged. These lessons weren't about preparing them for the real world. They were about shaping it. The other students paid little attention to these subtleties, since most of them seemed to already understand the rules of this particular game. Some of them came from families whose names Elias had overheard in the whispered conversations of his parents' associates, political dynasties, chemical magnates, families whose money was so old that no one even remembered what business had started it all. These were groups that didn't need to brag about power because they had always had it. Cliques formed naturally, not based on popularity, but on alliances that extended back generations. The kinds of friendships that were less about choice than inevitability. Over lunch, Elias would hear conversations about private nannies who raised siblings together, vacations taken on yachts that docked next to each other year after year, and the peculiar ways their parents ensured they would all stay connected. Yet even among this rarefied crowd, Elias noticed something different about his own role. His classmates occasionally threw out cryptic comments that unsettled him. Remarks like, "Well, someone like you doesn't really have to worry. Your path's already mapped." Or the way their gaze lingered when someone mentioned the academy's heavily restricted council wing, a building none of them were allowed to enter. "That's for the future," a boy once said, leaning back casually in his seat. "Well, for some of us." It was during the late fall that everything took a sharper turn. The academy hosted its annual Founders Gala, a surreal blend of lavish tradition and puzzling rituals. Invitations alone were coveted by the families of students, though Elias noticed that most adults treated the event with the seriousness that clashed with its pageantry. Everyone wore masks, ornate feathered pieces fit for a historical drama. The ballroom glimmered under light refracted from chandeliers, their crystals catching the flicker of the hundreds of candles placed in every corner. Elias wandered the room, feeling like an outsider peeking into something he wasn't meant to see. He heard conversations in hushed tones, phrases like the pillars of stability and guiding hands. It was as if this event wasn't just a party, but something far more important. Later in the evening, Victor Vance pulled Elias aside into a small parlour just off the ballroom. The mood shifted instantly as Victor closed the heavy oak doors behind them, blocking out the music and laughter. For years, Victor had spoken vaguely of their family's influence, but nothing could have prepared Elias for what came next. "You're old enough to start understanding now," he began, leaning closer to his son. "You don't just belong to this family. You are part of something far larger than you can imagine. We don't follow the tides of history. We make them. People and governments, nations and markets. They exist in cycles we've controlled for centuries. And one day, it will be your responsibility to ensure balance." Elias felt a cold weight settle in his chest as Victor handed him an ancient leather-bound book, its cover devoid of any title, only a raised eye etched onto its surface. When he opened it, Elias saw a series of detailed diagrams, names, and odd symbols. Though the writing was in a code he didn't understand, he could grasp the magnitude of what was in front of him. It wasn't just power his family held, it was control. This gala, this book, this conversation, these were Elias's first glimpses into the reality he'd been shielded from for so long, and as much as he wanted to run from it, the corridors of the academy wouldn't let him. Every lesson now felt deliberate. Every sideways glance from a teacher hinted at knowledge just out of reach. Even their occasional discussions on history began to sound different. Instead of focusing on dates and facts, they framed events as the result of careful orchestration, as though someone in the shadows was always pulling the strings. "Sometimes chaos is necessary," a history instructor once announced during a lecture, looking pointedly at Elias. "It just depends on who designs it." For some viewers, this fictional academy might feel outlandish, but parallels to real-life institutions often come up in conspiracy theories. Schools like Eton, Yale's Skull and Bones Society, or exclusive European preparatory academies are frequent targets of speculation. The idea is that families of enormous influence send their children to these elite places to ensure they continue a legacy of power. The theories often connect seemingly innocent traditions, initiation ceremonies, secret clubs, alumni loyalty, with broader ideas of a hidden ruling class. And while such theories aren't backed by solid evidence, they thrive on the fact that these institutions operate in precisely the kind of secrecy that fuels imagination. But for Elias, the academy wasn't abstract. It consumed every day. It was a carefully managed environment where every interaction, lesson, and tradition seemed choreographed to prepare him for a future he didn't choose and couldn't yet comprehend. And as Elias moved through its hallways, attending the cryptic seminars and studying the dynamics of his classmates' unspoken alliances, a sense of dread only grew stronger. The academy wasn't just a school, it was something else entirely, a mechanism, a machine designed to mold heirs into more than just leaders. It groomed them for something far greater and darker. Elias didn't yet understand the full cost of accepting such a legacy, but he could feel its weight pressing down on him. And so, his life at the academy became a question of survival, not in the literal sense, but in the quiet, suffocating way of trying to hold on to who you are when everyone seems determined to tell you who you must become. The deeper Elias went, the more he realized how tightly the threads of his life were being wound, strand by strand, into the fabric of something inescapable. But this realization begged another, more chilling question. How far would someone go to ensure their child continues the family legacy? The weight of conscience. Elias Vance had spent years perfecting the art of control. By the time he entered Vance Global Holdings as an executive, his life was shaped entirely to reflect the ideals of his family. His training, at home and at the academy, had sculpted him into a sharp and composed figure with an unmatched ability for negotiation. He knew how to close deals long before the first handshake, and could guide conversations so subtly that entire rooms would come to adopt his suggestions as their own thoughts. In many ways, Elias was the textbook example of what his father, Victor, had spent years planning. A successor who could navigate the hidden framework of power with precision. Vance Global Holdings wasn't just a corporation, it was a behemoth with tentacles that reached into industries across the world. Officially, it was involved in energy, finance, and communications, but Elias quickly learned that the real influence took place far away from public reports and board meetings. The company operated as an extension of the Circle's agenda, aligning policies and decisions with objectives that were never spoken openly. Revenues and success were merely byproducts of the conglomerate's true focus: control. Each move Elias made on behalf of the company was subtly directed by the unspoken rules enforced by Victor and the rest of the Vances. In the beginning, Elias went through the motions without complaint. He handled international trade negotiations, mediated disputes between governments and corporate bodies, and even resolved conflicts between business partners whose loyalties to the Circle needed reinforcement. His skills became so refined that his decisions barely felt like choices anymore. They were reactions, almost mechanical, all directed toward the same invisible goal. But as the years unfolded, Elias began to notice something troubling. Despite his family's constant praise for his success, he felt like a pawn. Every meeting, every deal, it all seemed predetermined by forces above him, ones that could not be questioned. More than once, he found himself in the back seat of a black limousine, watching the city lights blur past as he wondered if any of this was truly his decision or just part of Victor's plan. The breaking point came during what seemed, on the surface, like a routine assignment. Vance Global Holdings had targeted an emerging energy initiative, a philanthropic venture striving to distribute affordable, renewable energy sources across underdeveloped nations. The organization driving the project was small but growing, and its potential threatened to disrupt the well-established systems the Circle preferred. Victor approached Elias with the task, as if handing him a simple business memo. "This project romanticizes chaos," he said with a dispassionate shrug. Stability requires scarcity, and scarcity relies on control. If this initiative is allowed to spread, it weakens everything we've built. Shut it down." Elias didn't respond. He simply accepted the folder Victor handed him and walked out of the study. At first, he told himself it was just another negotiation, something that required calculation, precision, and the right leverage to achieve the desired result. But as he pored over the details of the energy project, he couldn't shake the growing feeling that something was wrong. The initiative promised energy independence to vulnerable communities, freeing them from reliance on oil markets controlled by companies like Vance Global Holdings. The more Elias read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just business. It was sabotage, plain and simple. Still, Elias proceeded with the task. Months of quiet interference followed. He bribed local officials to delay permits, spread rumors of unsafe manufacturing practices, and manipulated funding networks to deny the organization access to critical resources. Each action was a calculated step to suffocate the energy project until it collapsed under the weight of its own potential. And it worked. Within 6 months, the initiative was shut down entirely. Its founder publicly disgraced by a fabricated financial scandal. To the outside world, it was a failure of management. To Elias, it was something far worse. The aftermath was heavier than Elias had anticipated. The guilt started small, just a whisper at the back of his mind. He tried to suppress it, focusing on the efficiency of the operation and how seamlessly it had all been executed. But in quiet moments, away from the urgency of deadlines and meetings, he couldn't escape what he'd done. He replayed news segments reporting on the initiative's closure, watching as communities that would have benefited from the project slipped further into poverty. He thought about the founder, a woman whose life's work had been reduced to a punchline in financial tabloids. Her face lingered on the edges of his memory, her voice cracking with disbelief during an interview. "We just wanted something better," she had said, her hands trembling as she held back tears. At night, Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse apartment. No amount of luxury could quiet the unease that had taken root inside him. He began avoiding Victor's calls, finding excuses to skip the weekly meetings where projects like the energy sabotage were casually discussed over wine and dinner. For the first time, Elias started questioning everything he had built his life around. Was this the legacy his family was so proud of? Was this control? These doubts didn't exist in a vacuum. Many whistleblowers in history have faced similar internal battles, torn between their responsibilities and their conscience. One such case was Thomas Keane, a former FBI data analyst whose decision to expose classified documents mirrored Elias's own struggle. Keane had spent nearly a decade compiling reports on government anomalies. His realization, much like Elias's, wasn't sparked by abstract principles or theoretical harm. It was a single event. He uncovered evidence of a government-orchestrated crisis, its details hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. The weight of that discovery pushed Keane to act, just as Elias's experience with the sabotage began to push him toward an irreversible crossroads. As Keane once stated, "You hold the truth in one hand, loyalty in the other, but the truth always has a sharper edge." Elias's edge came not from documents or reports, but from the clarity of seeing the direct consequences of his actions. The philanthropic project wasn't just an abstract cause. It was real. It had faces, voices, lives tied to it. And now it was gone, erased by his family's quiet command. He began distancing himself from Vance Global Holdings, skipping internal meetings and delegating his responsibilities to subordinates. Victor's calls became more insistent, and eventually an invitation arrived for another family dinner, a thinly veiled demand for Elias's presence. Still, Elias proceeded with the task. Months of quiet interference followed. He bribed local officials to delay permits, spread rumours of unsafe manufacturing practices, and manipulated funding networks to deny the organisation access to critical resources. Each action was a calculated step to suffocate the energy project until it collapsed under the weight of its own potential. And it worked. Within 6 months, the initiative was shut down entirely. Its founder publicly disgraced by a fabricated financial scandal. To the outside world, it was a failure of management. To Elias, it was something far worse. The aftermath was heavier than Elias had anticipated. The guilt started small, just a whisper at the back of his mind. He tried to suppress it, focusing on the efficiency of the operation and how seamlessly it had all been executed. But in quiet moments, away from the urgency of deadlines and meetings, he couldn't escape what he'd done. He replayed news segments reporting on the initiative's closure, watching as communities that would have benefited from the project slipped further into poverty. He thought about the founder, a woman whose life's work had been reduced to a punchline in financial tabloids. Her face lingered on the edges of his memory, her voice cracking with disbelief during an interview. "We just wanted something better," she had said, her hands trembling as she held back tears. At night, Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse apartment. No amount of luxury could quiet the unease that had taken root inside him. He began avoiding Victor's calls, finding excuses to skip the weekly meetings where projects like the energy sabotage were casually discussed over wine and dinner. For the first time, Elias started questioning everything he had built his life around. Was this the legacy his family was so proud of? Was this control? These doubts didn't exist in a vacuum. Many whistleblowers in history have faced similar internal battles, torn between their responsibilities and their conscience. One such case was Thomas Keane, a former FBI data analyst whose decision to expose classified documents mirrored Elias's own struggle. Keane had spent nearly a decade compiling reports on government anomalies. His realization, much like Elias's, wasn't sparked by abstract principles or theoretical harm. It was a single event. He uncovered evidence of a government-orchestrated crisis, its details hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. The weight of that discovery pushed Keane to act, just as Elias's experience with the sabotage began to push him toward an irreversible crossroads. As Keane once stated, "You hold the truth in one hand, loyalty in the other, but the truth always has a sharper edge." Elias's edge came not from documents or reports, but from the clarity of seeing the direct consequences of his actions. The philanthropic project wasn't just an abstract cause. It was real. It had faces, voices, lives tied to it. And now it was gone, erased by his family's quiet command. He began distancing himself from Vance Global Holdings, skipping internal meetings and delegating his responsibilities to subordinates. Victor's calls became more insistent, and eventually an invitation arrived for another family dinner, a thinly veiled demand for Elias's presence. The revelation in the archive. The library in the Vance mansion had always been a place of reverence, with its towering shelves of leather-bound books and the smell of polished wood mixed with aged paper. As a child, Elias Vance saw it as a quiet refuge, somewhere to escape the stiff formality of his family's life. But even as an adult, looking at the rows of books, he never fully appreciated what it concealed. That changed one winter night. Victor Vance had left for a last-minute meeting, and the household was quiet, save for the occasional muffled steps of staff. On impulse, Elias wandered into the library, his mind restless. The bookcases never seemed out of order, the symmetry of the space unsettling in its perfection, but something felt different. As he paced along the perimeter of the room, passing by the family crest, carved intricately into the wood above the fireplace. Under the light of the sconces, the lines seemed to shift, almost as if guiding him closer. That's when he noticed it. A faint outline along one of the wooden panels. It was barely discernible, but enough to trigger his curiosity. He pressed against it, and with a soft mechanical click, the panel slid open. Behind it, a narrow staircase spiraled downward, shrouded in shadows. Elias hesitated at the top of the staircase. The air felt still, heavy, as though time itself had paused to mark the moment. Slowly he descended, each step creaking underfoot. At the bottom, a door stood ajar, opening into a room that was starkly different from the ornate mansion above. This wasn't a place designed to impress. It was cold, industrial, and utilitarian. In the center of the room stood several filing cabinets, dimly lit by a single overhead light. Beside them, a sleek computer terminal silently waited, its black screen glowing faintly in the dark. Curiosity turned into unease as Elias approached the computer. The login screen displayed a familiar symbol, an eye within a triangle, the crest he had grown up seeing everywhere in his home. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before attempting the obvious. Typing his name and birthday, he watched as the screen confirmed access. The moment it unlocked, the words "Global Project Summaries" appeared in stark white text. A long list of files followed, each tagged with a name and an innocuous description. But as he scrolled, the entries pulled his attention in ways he hadn't anticipated. The first file he opened documented an election in South America many years earlier. The text revealed step-by-step instructions on how the Circle had manipulated local operatives, disseminated false narratives, and ensured the right candidate rose to power. Another dealt with the suppression of a groundbreaking medical cure, detailing how pharmaceutical patents and disinformation campaigns had kept the breakthrough buried. There were files on wars, conflicts spanning decades, framed not as political inevitabilities, but as deliberate designs, orchestrated to tip economies and consolidate power in favor of select interests. Elias's mind raced as he skimmed through decades, even centuries, of carefully coordinated manipulation. One entry stood out in particular, an agreement tagged to 1913, outlining the introduction of a centralized global banking structure that, over generations, would subtly erode both local governance and financial autonomy. Sweeping terms like control mechanisms and narrative management appeared frequently, their clinical tone a chilling contrast to the human cost that lingered unspoken between the lines. Elias realized he wasn't looking at theories or conjecture. This wasn't someone's speculation about a shadowy elite. This was documentation, built and maintained meticulously by those directly involved. The deeper he looked, the worse it became. Descriptions of manipulated famines, trade disruptions, and even seemingly natural disasters unfolded across the screen. A file labeled Project Keystone mapped the ways foundational pieces of infrastructure were quietly acquired over decades, ensuring invisible leverage over transport, communication, and global supply chains. Another, titled Arcadia, outlined mass psychological experiments carried out through the fabric of daily life. Media manipulation, propaganda disguised as entertainment, algorithms designed to polarize societies while keeping systems of control intact. Elias removed a flash drive from his pocket, sliding it into the computer's port without hesitation. If even half of what these files claimed was true, it was evidence that went beyond anything the public could imagine. The slow pulsing of the drive's light calmed him slightly as he began downloading as much as he could. Somewhere between the digital transfers, his focus shifted. the words on the files blurred, replaced by the faces they affected. Millions, maybe billions of lives touched by these orchestrations, all of them unaware of the patterns behind their struggles. The weight of it pressed on him more heavily than ever before. By the time the download was complete, his breath felt heavy, his mind crowding with thoughts he couldn't voice. This discovery wasn't just a glimpse into how deeply rooted his family's operations were. It was confirmation. The control Victor spoke of wasn't hyperbole. It was measured and methodical, written out clearly in directives like war strategies or corporate policies. Elias caught a reflection of himself in the screen, his face pale under the faint light, and thought, how many lives has my family stolen? Conspiracy theorists often speak about secret agendas and suppressed truths, but they rarely agree on the scope of such plans. Some theories imply that tragic world events, diseases, and even technological stagnation are the result of coordinated schemes. The files Elias found mirrored these claims almost too perfectly. The masses respond to symbols and stories, not facts, one file stated, echoing what his professor at the academy had drilled into him years ago. Another claimed, stability requires strategic imbalance, a philosophy underpinning the decisions laid bare across this archive. The sheer boldness of it reminded him of certain claims he had read before. For example, whistleblowers like Thomas Keane, who once uncovered documents showing coordinated economic conflicts, described their findings as proof of a controlled theatre designed to pacify the powerless. Similarly, certain conspiracy researchers had argued that wars and financial crashes were less random shifts than curated events to protect the interests of a global elite. Elias had dismissed these ideas as exaggerations in the past, but now, with undeniable proof glowing in front of him, he wasn't so sure. Copying the files brought a flicker of purpose through the despair. He wasn't a child anymore, told to fall in line and accept the shadows of his home. He couldn't keep living like this, not when knowing came with the responsibility to act. Still, the enormity of what he now held wasn't a comfort, it was a curse. Walking out of the archive that night, files in hand, Elias felt like he'd cracked open a door no one wanted him to touch, much less walk through. Secrecy had always shrouded his father's operations and the peculiar rehearsed ways of the circle, but the truth was sharper and more extensive than even Elias could have predicted. Years of training and warnings about loyalty now felt like hollow echoes. This wasn't about family pride or a greater good. It was theft on a scale too vast to comprehend. And for what? Power, fear, the need to maintain an illusion of order by casting millions into chaos. The mansion seemed quieter than usual as Elias climbed back up the hidden staircase and into the safety of the main floors. It wasn't simply late, it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. The flash drive in his pocket weighed heavier than it should, a symbol of everything he was about to risk. He knew the circle's rules well enough to predict what came next. If anyone found out about the files, about what he'd copied, there would be no negotiation, no plea for understanding. He could already picture his father's cold eyes cutting through any explanation. Still, as he stood in his childhood bedroom and stared out the frost-lined windows, Elias felt something shift. For the first time, he didn't feel trapped by the mansion's walls, the crest above the fireplace, or even the legacy he'd been born into. He wasn't just processing the weight of what he'd uncovered, he was deciding what came next. Because now, Elias didn't just know the truth, he owned it. The question that haunted him wasn't about the files themselves, but what he was willing to do with them. Standing in the quiet of early morning, Elias asked the question again. How do you bring the truth to light when the world is determined to silence you? The whistleblower's gambit. Elias knew there was no turning back. Once he had copied the file, the weight of what he was holding became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just evidence. This was proof that could reshape how people saw the world. Proof that could undo the foundation his father and the circle had worked so hard to maintain. But getting it out into the world was a problem he couldn't solve alone. He'd grown up in a fortress of secrets and control. The kind of environment where disobedience was met with swift consequences. If even the smallest whisper of his betrayal reached the circle, his life would become forfeit. That in mind, he turned to someone who had dedicated her life to uncovering what others wanted to stay buried. Ava Monroe wasn't easy to contact. Trusting the wrong source was a risk she couldn't afford. As an investigative journalist, she'd built her reputation on her ability to expose corruption no one else would touch. Her tenacity made her a threat to the very systems Elias was trying to defy, and that's exactly why he chose her. She had no loyalties to the circles of power that dominated his world. If anyone could amplify his revelations, it would be her. Elias began cautiously. Using a pseudonym, he crafted a single encrypted email just enough to pique Ava's interest, but not enough to reveal what he had or who he was. You've written before about power structures that don't welcome sunlight, the message read. What if I could prove they're darker than you imagined? He included only one file, a heavily redacted document from the archive. The details were enough to outline the manipulation of a significant international election, but vague enough to avoid immediately implicating himself. If Ava wasn't interested or didn't trust him, this would end here. Her reply came within hours. Polite but skeptical, she opened with questions designed to verify the file's authenticity. What's your source? Can you back this information? It wasn't the response of someone easily swayed, and Elias respected that. Skepticism was Ava's armor, protecting her not just from false leads, but from the dangers of pursuing the truth. Too often, whistleblowers made claims, without evidence, leaving journalists like her in impossible positions. Ava had no patience for speculation. She made that clear. If you expect me to run with this story, give me something to verify. Elias didn't respond immediately. Instead, he spent the next several days carefully selecting which pieces of information to share next. Each one had to carry enough weight to gain her trust without creating a trail too easy to trace. Little by little, he sent her more documents from the archive. Her skepticism began to thaw as she cross-referenced the data with her own leads, picking up small but unmistakable patterns that aligned with her past investigations. The scale of the information became undeniable. This was no wild theory. It was well documented, deliberate, and, most importantly, actionable. Their communication grew more frequent, but with each exchange, the risks mounted. Establishing secure lines wasn't easy. Not when the Circle had the resources to monitor almost every form of communication. Elias insisted on encryption layered over temporary accounts that vanished within hours. But even this wasn't foolproof. Ava suggested meeting in person, but he refused. "You don't know who might be watching," he wrote in one message. "These people are everywhere." Ava, used to cautious sources, didn't push him. She knew better than to underestimate the reach of the kinds of forces Elias described. Still, distance didn't make them safer. Elias started noticing small changes around him. Staff members at the Vance estate lingered a little too long when asking simple questions. A black SUV parked across the street from his apartment felt more conspicuous than the usual blend of idle cars lining the city's streets. Late one evening, as he entered his building, the front desk attendant gestured to a man who'd been asking for him earlier in the day. "He said he was with one of your family's companies," she explained. Elias nodded politely, but the pit in his stomach grew sharper. He'd been careful, but the Circle's reach was vast, and its suspicions relentless. Ava also began to feel the tension. One morning, she found a message stuck on her car's windshield, a simple note with her name typed neatly across the top. The paper smelled faintly of cologne. "We know where to find you," it read. Threats like these were part of her work, but this one felt heavier, not in what it said, but in what it implied. Someone knew what she was working on. There was no denying that now. Still, she pressed on, her resolve as sharp as ever. If anything, the threat only convinced her that the story Elias was telling needed to see daylight. Together, the two devised a plan. Ava's connections weren't confined to mainstream outlets. She knew how to distribute information where it couldn't easily be silenced. To her, the files weren't just news. They were a chance to rewrite the rules of accountability, but they both agreed that releasing the files alone wouldn't be enough. They needed context, a human face, to temper the weight of what people were about to see. That's when Elias proposed his personal confession. The idea unsettled her at first. "Are you sure?" she asked him during one of their exchanges. "Once your face is out there, there's no going back. They'll know it's you." But Elias had made his decision long before he suggested it. "If I do this behind a screen, I lose the one thing they can't manipulate, my identity. People need to hear this from me." The plan unfolded methodically. Ava would schedule timed data releases across independent outlets and encrypted platforms, ensuring mass distribution. At the same time, Elias would record a statement revealing his role in the Vance dynasty, his discovery of the archives, and the truths laid out in the files. The confession wasn't crafted to make him a hero. It was a warning. "You don't know my name," he would say into the camera, "but you know the forces my family represents. You felt their influence in ways you didn't even realize. It's time to see what's been hiding in plain sight." Real-world whistleblowers have used similar strategies to protect their stories from being buried. In 2013, Edward Snowden's revelations about global surveillance were accompanied by on-camera interviews that made his face inseparable from the truth he exposed. The strategy worked, not because people agreed or disagreed with his actions, but because they understood the personal cost of his choices. His face, his words, made the abstract tangible. Elias hoped his confession would carry the same weight. As the day approached, the pressure felt unrelenting. Ava watched as Elias, once guarded and detached in his messages, began to admit flashes of doubt. He asked her once, "What if no one believes it? What if the files are too much for people to accept?" Ava responded simply, "It's not about everyone believing immediately. It's about planting the doubt where it needs to grow." Her words hung with him, and in some ways, they comforted him. The truth didn't need to break the world instantly. It only needed to find those who would listen. When the uploads began, everything seemed to flash by in slow motion. As the files leaked, Elias's confession went live across hundreds of platforms, its reach growing faster than the circle could suppress. His calm, deliberate voice filled screens around the world, narrating the unbroken chain of power his family had wielded for generations. Alongside the confession, the files, dense, detailed, impossible to dismiss, were downloaded thousands, then millions of times. Ava watched the chaos unfold from one of her safe houses. "It's begun," she thought. But relief was fleeting. She knew the storm had only just started brewing. Elias's face was everywhere now. Proof of the man who'd pulled back the curtain. And as the leak spread, so did the consequences for daring to expose the system. The question wasn't whether the circle would retaliate. The question was when. The circle strikes back. What happens when everything hidden is suddenly exposed? For the circle, the grand gathering was supposed to be a celebration of continuity, a reminder of their centuries-old dominance. It was a rare event, one few outside the inner circle would ever know existed. Inside the vast stone hall, lit by the orange glow of chandeliers and punctuated by the deep timbre of low murmurs and occasional laughter, the air seemed heavy with confidence. They moved freely among one another, dressed in custom suits and formal evening gowns, their conversations layered with coded phrases that only they could decipher. Everything about the gathering seemed rehearsed, measured, and perfectly under their control, until it wasn't. It began with the faint buzz of a phone vibrating against a polished oak table, then another, and another, as screens lit up, expressions shifted. At first, confused frowns, and then something darker. A ripple of unease coursed through the room, gradually silencing the steady hum of conversation. Whispers spread like wildfire as more members checked their devices. A single name rose among the murmurs. Elias. Victor Vance stood at the center of the room, his usual air of control faltering ever so slightly as he glanced at the glowing phone in his hand. On the screen was Elias's face, a pre-recorded confession broadcast to millions. There he was, calmly explaining everything they had spent lifetimes concealing. The archives, the manipulation, the system itself. Around Victor, members of the circle watched in stunned silence, their disbelief laced with growing anger. The enormity of the betrayal was sinking in. Elias had not only revealed the truth, but he had given the public the keys to explore it themselves. Victor's grip tightened around the edges of the phone until his knuckles turned white. When Victor spoke, it cut through the silence like the crack of a whip. Where is he? The question wasn't rhetorical. It was an order. He turned sharply, his gaze narrowing on one of the senior members nearby. How did this happen? How is my son not already accounted for? The man blinked, hesitating for only a second too long. That hesitation made it clear. Elias's betrayal wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was an act they hadn't seen coming in time to stop. But Elias hadn't waited to see the fallout. Hours before the gathering began, he had already put his escape plan in motion. He'd learned enough from years of watching his father operate to understand the circle's tactics. Hesitation would mean death, and arrogance would only make him easier to find. He left his apartment behind without a second glance, trading tailored suits for a hood and plain jeans. His phone, his credit cards, all were abandoned. The drive he'd used to store the leaked files now sat deep in Ava's arsenal. All he had to do was stay alive while her efforts unfolded. But in every second that followed, staying alive started to feel more impossible. As the realization of Elias's actions swept through the gathering, Victor's fury turned personal. His voice dropped into a low, controlled growl as he addressed the room. We find him, we make this right. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Around him, the circle's silent machinery began to turn. The men and women in that room were not ordinary bystanders. They had resources that extended far beyond government oversight. Tracking Elias was a problem they intended to solve swiftly. Meanwhile, Elias was already on the move. He slipped through crowded subway stations and train terminals, keeping his head low. Every second felt like the next step in a high-stakes game where the players were invisible, but their eyes were everywhere. Cameras, databases, informants. He knew how the circle operated. They didn't need brute force to find someone like him. They needed access to systems they already owned. Systems that normal people never questioned. From surveillance on city streets to the banking records that could pinpoint someone's location in seconds. The only way to survive was to disappear completely, erasing his trail before it began. As he moved from one location to the next, it became clear just how vast the circle's reach was. At one point, Elias ducked into a small rundown cafe to catch his breath. But as he glanced out the window, he saw a black SUV idling across the street. It looked familiar, not in a specific way, but in the way that signals danger when instinct takes over. The license plate was illegible under the dust of the city's grime, but Elias didn't need confirmation. He slipped out through the back door and into the maze of narrow alleys, feeling the slow burn of adrenaline as he ran. Back at the Vance estate, Victor convened a smaller group of trusted operatives. He had raised Elias to understand loyalty as a principle, not a choice. The betrayal hit him on levels both personal and pragmatic. But it was the pragmatism that guided his next steps. As Victor stared out over the mansion's darkened gardens, he issued commands calmly. He didn't yell or pace. No, Victor was deliberate, precise. No more waiting, he said to the group gathered around him. We track every connection he's ever made, cut off his options, bring him in alive if possible. But if it's not, then we ensure the damage stops here. Stories like Elias's aren't without precedent. Whistleblowers who've exposed deeply rooted systems of power face retaliation that often feels disproportionate to their revelations. Thomas Keane, a well-documented case, described moments where the lines between being hunted and simply being watched became indistinguishable. They're everywhere and nowhere, he once stated, hinting at the constant surveillance and isolation he experienced. Elias was now living that reality, a world shrinking around him, even as he tried to outrun it. Each movement brought new risks. Safe houses weren't safe for long. Contacts, the few willing to hear him out, often disconnected after a single meeting, realizing the enormity of what siding with him meant. There were moments when Elias wanted to question his own choice. He had leaked the truth, yes, but at what cost? His name and face were now a symbol of defiance to some, but to those within the circle, they represented the gravest kind of crime, disloyalty. The final hours of that night were a blur. The turning point came in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city. One of Ava's contacts had arranged for Elias to meet there while they coordinated his next move. He entered through a heavy metal door, the sound of the city muffled behind him. But as he scanned the room, the familiar shadow of dread crept over him. Something felt wrong. Before he could react, footsteps echoed sharply from the far side of the warehouse. "Elias!" A voice called out, deep and unmistakable. "Victor." The confrontation was tense. Both men standing at a distance that felt impossibly vast despite the few feet between them. Victor's tone was measured but cold, his disappointment cutting through the air. "You've made a mistake you don't get to come back from," he said. "Do you understand what you've done? Do you even grasp the scale of the chaos you've unleashed?" But Elias didn't falter. For the first time, he met his father's gaze without hesitation. "It's not chaos," Elias replied. "It's truth. Something you can't keep hidden anymore." Victor's composure shattered briefly, his expression twisting with an emotion that was equal parts anger and betrayal. The moment froze, but only for a second. Behind him, movement began, men slowly advancing toward Elias. He didn't wait to see what came next. Turning sharply, he sprinted toward the warehouse's rear exit, his heart pounding in his ears. The chase through the city streets was relentless, the circle's operatives closing in, block by block. But Elias had planned for this. Long before that night, he'd memorized the paths no one else knew, the alleys without cameras, the places the circle's influence didn't stretch. By dawn, he had slipped through their grasp, but barely. He knew this wasn't a victory. It was survival, temporary and fragile. Now he was a fugitive, hunted by forces that could rewrite the rules to catch him. There would be no safety, no stillness, not as long as the circle believed they could erase what he had done. But how do you survive when the world's most powerful forces are against you? The cost of truth. Elias Vance spent his final days moving from safe house to safe house, a shadow of the man he had once been. He was no longer the poised, calculated figure groomed to inherit his family's empire. Instead, he was someone stripped of all illusions, clinging to the slimmest thread of freedom, knowing at any moment it could snap. No place ever felt secure, not for longer than a single night. Each move carried new risks. He slept light, if at all, always listening for the sound of unexpected footsteps or the hum of an approaching vehicle outside a supposedly secure location. The isolation, though, was the worst part. Even with the files now public, even with Ava Monroe continuing to fight for the truth, Elias was utterly alone in the most profound sense. Unable to trust anyone, even the few contacts still brave enough to offer him shelter. The circle's reach was vast, and Elias had lived his entire life intimately aware of its scope. He knew they didn't need to kick in doors or scatter agents on every street corner to find him. Their power came from the systems already in place. The records, the databases, the surveillance no ordinary person could escape, even with Ava's help and his meticulous planning. Elias was constantly outrunning a force that fought its battles invisibly. His name had been flagged in places no normal police database could reach. The resources tracking him were beyond governmental oversight, wielding tools the average person couldn't imagine. Every step felt presaged by a whisper of inevitability. It wasn't a matter of if they would find him, but when. The fear ate away at him in small, unrelenting ways. He stopped making eye contact with people on the street and checked his reflection less often in mirrors. He avoided shopkeepers, the warmth of their curiosity feeling sharper than any blade. Even the most ordinary details of daily life became sinister. An unfamiliar car parked across the street, a barista's lingering glance, the sudden absence of one of his trusted safe house contacts who had promised to call back but didn't. Elias's world shrunk into a series of guarded movements. His thoughts circled endlessly around the same question. When would the circle strike? When would the running end? The decision to flee to Iceland wasn't one he made lightly. The country's reputation for respecting whistleblowers and its physical distance from the centre of the circle's power were as much a draw as the isolation itself. It was one of the few places still untouched by the invisible chains woven through much of the world's systems. Ava argued that it could buy him the time he needed to regroup, or at the very least, keep him out of direct reach, while new parts of the files continued to surface. Still, Elias knew the simplicity of the plan was also its flaw. The Circle, for all their secrecy, prided themselves on being 10 steps ahead. In Iceland, he might find safety, or he might be walking straight into a trap. The hours leading up to his departure blurred together in a haze of tension. He travelled under a falsified identity, the passport arranged through one of Ava's underground contacts. Boarding the plane was its own gamble. The lingering paranoia that someone might recognise him every bit as suffocating as the Circle's looming presence. He kept his hood low, his head bowed, aware that every surveillance camera in the terminal could be feeding information into networks he couldn't hope to outsmart. Even seated on the plane, his heart didn't slow. He avoided the gaze of flight attendants, barely spoke when prompted for his drink order, and kept his bag close enough to grip tight if necessary. Every small detail felt like something that could betray him, and yet, despite the fear coursing through him, something deeper carried him forward, a stubborn resolve that had only strengthened since the files went public. He had known the cost of defying the Circle from the moment he walked out of the archive with the flash drive in his pocket. But knowing and experiencing it were two very different things. Months of running had turned that abstract understanding into something visceral. The exhaustion, the fear, the gradual erosion of self. It was an experience that mirrored what so many other whistleblowers had faced before him. Those who stood against the powerful often paid for their convictions with their lives or their sanity. The psychological toll of his actions had already begun to carve deep into him. Researchers who study whistleblowers often describe their experience as one of sustained trauma. They're everywhere and nowhere. Thomas Keane, a former whistleblower, noted during an interview. Elias now understood those words in a way no prior reading or discussion could have prepared him for. Every safe house felt like a hollow reprieve. Every shadow contained the possibility of being watched. Weeks on the run had become one long, uninterrupted siege on his mind, every passing hour tightening the net around his thoughts. For Elias, though, none of this compared to the memory of the archive and the files it had contained. That memory was both his burden and his only source of solace. He clung to it on nights when fear threatened to close in completely. The images of orchestrated wars, suppressed cures, and manufactured crises weren't just numbers on a screen. They were lives, real and tangible, devastated without their knowledge. That knowledge was what gave him purpose. Even now, if exposing the truth came at the cost of his freedom or even his life, wasn't it still worth it? Hadn't the circle stolen enough from others or kept enough hidden to justify any individual sacrifice made in the name of revealing their reach? As the plane ascended, Elias stared out the window at the clouds gathering below, his thoughts heavy. He was painfully aware that boarding this flight had narrowed his options. If the circle was waiting for him upon landing, there would be no escape. Still, a strange calm settled over him. Even if Iceland wasn't the safe haven he hoped for, Elias knew that to stop moving, to stop acting, would mean surrendering to the kind of control the circle had spent centuries perfecting. In his confession video, he had told the world, "You don't fight structures like this for yourself. You fight for the people who don't even know they've lost something." Now those words felt less like a proclamation and more like a quiet mantra, a lifeline as the plane hummed steadily through the sky. Hours passed. The plane neared its destination. Then, somewhere over the North Atlantic, something went wrong. Reports would later state that the loss of communication was sudden. Air traffic control couldn't explain it, nor could the investigators who would comb through the wreckage days later. By the time the plane disappeared from radar, it was gone with no warning, no recorded distress calls, and no explanations. Elias Vance was presumed dead, his face plastered across news reports as the man who had risked everything to expose a hidden world and paid the ultimate price. To many who knew the circle's ways, the crash raised eyebrows. The coincidence felt too sharp, too clean. Whispers suggested that the crash wasn't an accident, that the circle had left nothing to chance. After all, their reach was global, and Elias's survival had become a liability they couldn't afford. Regardless of the truth, the impact was immediate. Elias's death pushed his revelations further into the public eye. Suddenly, his name became more than just news. It became a symbol, a rallying cry for those who had always suspected the existence of unseen power but never had proof. Stories aren't supposed to end like this, are they? Tragic yet incomplete, with no final resolution. And yet, Elias's disappearance wasn't the end of his legacy. The files he'd released continued to circulate. Ava Monroe, undeterred by the risks, kept releasing more details, ensuring the light he'd shone didn't dim. For every skeptic who dismissed the revelations as conspiracy, there were others who started to dig deeper, asking questions they never had before. Elias had vanished, but his voice lingered, clear, resolute, and defiant. You don't fight for yourself. You fight for the people who don't even know they've lost something. Iceland had been the last stop on his journey, but the fight he started was just beginning. So now the question remains, what happens to the truth after it's exposed? The legacy of Elias Vance. When Elias Vance's revelations first broke, they felt like an earthquake, shaking the foundations of trust in a world many believed to be free. From the moment his confession video went live, people began flooding social media with questions, theories, and outrage. For days, the leaked files dominated headlines, sparking debates across news channels and dinner tables alike. But after the shock came a deeper uncertainty that no one seemed ready for. Because as groundbreaking as Elias's files were, the question remained, who would believe them? For some, the leaks were irrefutable proof of something they had suspected all along, a hidden system silently orchestrating what they believed to be coincidence or chaos. Protest groups began forming, demanding transparency, accountability, and investigations into the powerful families and entities named in the files. Online forums lit up with discussions, dissecting every fragment of data Elias had released. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a hunger to know what had been taken from them. Some users compiled timelines, linking the file's contents to familiar world events. Others created intricate charts, weaving together the threads of control Elias had unveiled. The documents weren't just information, they were a rallying cry. For this growing movement, Elias wasn't just a whistleblower. He was a symbol of defiance against everything they believed had been hidden. But not everyone saw it that way. In fact, for many others, the entire story felt suspicious, impossible, Could one man really pull the curtain back on systems so vast that most people weren't even aware of their existence? Detractors flooded news outlets and social platforms with skepticism, dismissing the leaks as fabrications or outright propaganda. "It's too convenient," one commentator said on live television. "These files just happen to surface out of nowhere, claiming to expose a centuries-old conspiracy." The truth, they argued, was simpler. Either Elias was a pawn in a larger disinformation campaign, or the files themselves were expertly crafted forgeries. Mainstream media outlets began using words like unverified and hoax to describe the data, even as reporters scrambled to publish pieces dissecting its contents. The Circle, of course, wasted no time in turning this skepticism to its advantage. While Elias had hoped to shine a light on their workings, they used their influence to flood the airwaves and news feeds with deliberate disinformation. Trusted anchors framed the leaks as a classic case of foreign interference, pointing fingers at rival nations known for cyber espionage. Carefully curated editorials dismissed Elias as unstable, calling him a victim of delusion or manipulation. Some even claimed that artificial intelligence could have fabricated the files, producing data so detailed and credible-looking that no human could discern the difference. The strategy worked. The more the public heard these explanations, the harder it became to discern fiction from truth. Yet, even amidst the growing doubt, something began to shift. No matter how loudly the media discredited the leaks, cracks started to show in the facade the Circle had worked so hard to maintain. People who had never questioned the world's systems began wondering, what if even a fraction of it was real? Politicians and business leaders named in the files started issuing vague denials, or worse, staying conspicuously silent. And as the media's focus on discrediting the story intensified, it had the unintended effect of drawing even more eyes to the files. Why spend so much effort calling it a lie? One user on an online forum wrote, "If there's nothing to it." But for many, what mattered wasn't the immediate reactions of media or governments, it was what came next. Symbols of Elias's sacrifice began appearing in unexpected places. In a small city in southern Europe, a mural of his face was painted on the side of an abandoned building, accompanied by the words, "The truth isn't in shadows, it's in the light." In Los Angeles, a group of activists projected clips of his confession video onto the walls of government buildings late at night. Across social media, his name became a hashtag, trending alongside images of the very documents the Circle had tried to bury. The most powerful impact, though, was less visible. Small underground communities began to form, inspired by the files. These weren't groups of fringe conspiracy theorists. They were ordinary people, teachers, artists, factory workers, working together to uncover more about the systems that shaped their lives. To them, Elias wasn't just a whistleblower. He was the first crack in a wall they had always assumed was unbreakable. His name became shorthand for a question no one could ignore, a challenge to rethink how much of what we accept might actually be invisible control. History tells us that moments of exposure like this often unfold slowly. The truth doesn't always inspire instant change. Sometimes it plants seeds. Stories of whistleblowers like Elias carry a kind of unintended momentum, one with unpredictable consequences. Edward Snowden, for instance, faced a similar arc when he leaked information about global surveillance programs. The initial public response was uncertain. Were his actions justified, or were they reckless? For months, governments scrambled to frame the narrative, dismissing his leaks while simultaneously bracing for their fallout. Today, his name is synonymous with the fight for privacy. His actions didn't dismantle global surveillance, but they did reshape how people think about it. In the same way, Elias's story wasn't about immediate results. Most of the world remained skeptical or simply moved on, consumed by the churn of daily life. But beneath the surface, something profound was happening. Every protest inspired by the files, every mural of his image on city walls, every small discussion sparked at coffee shop tables, they were the beginnings of something bigger. The impact wasn't in swaying everyone at once. It was in challenging the idea of unquestioned systems, in making people ask why they accepted the way things were. Ava Monroe emerged as a central figure in keeping Elias' story alive. Though the immediate coverage faded, Ava continued publishing pieces based on the remaining data he had shared. Her work ensured that the files weren't forgotten, even as the circle doubled down on its effort to discredit her. Some journalists turned away, unwilling to join her in risking their careers or their lives for a story no one wanted to believe. But Ava pressed on, operating from safe houses, communicating selectively, and distributing her findings through non-traditional outlets. She refused to let the circle bury Elias's sacrifice. Perhaps the real legacy of Elias Vance wasn't the files he leaked, but the way they made people see the world differently. Once people knew to look, they began noticing other things. The strange patterns in financial markets, the eerily uniform narratives in global news, the consistency of certain power structures no matter how turbulent politics appeared. The files gave them a lens, and through that lens, they saw cracks in the systems that had once seemed unbreakable. Elias's story wasn't about exposing the full truth in one moment. It was about making sure the world could never fully go back to sleep. Today, his name continues to inspire those who question. His image, painted on walls and shared across continents, has become a global symbol, not of rebellion, but of quiet defiance against systems built on silence. For those who believe in his message, Elias represents a single, undeniable idea that even in the most hidden, powerful structures, secrets can be exposed. And while his life may have ended far from the world he reshaped, his story is far from over. What happens when one small crack forms in a structure no one thought could break? That's the question Elias leaves us with. His legacy isn't a resolved narrative, it's an open-ended challenge. What can we learn from those who expose the light? The cost of exposing the truth is immense, but the cracks it creates in systems of power are undeniable. Elias Vance's story shows that even in the face of overwhelming control, one act of courage can ripple outward. Through his actions, what was hidden became visible, and what seemed unshakable began to fracture. It's a stark reminder: the pursuit of truth demands sacrifice, but its impact is lasting. What hidden truths might you uncover if you dared to look closer? Elias's journey reminds us that even in darkness, there are those who choose to expose the light, no matter the cost.